So this is Corporate Accountability Forums with Jim McRitchie, produced by Eric Weinstein. We delve into the issues and possible solutions with experts in the field, primarily focused on what institutional and retail shareholders can do. Next week, our guest speaker will be David Weber, author of The Rise of the Working Class Shareholder, Labor's Last Best Weapon. This week, fresh off congressional testimony, I want to welcome Judy Samuelson, founder and executive director of the Aspen Institute's Business and Society program, as well as the author of 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Real Value in a Changing World. Judy's program at Aspen provides her with opportunities to discuss significant issues with business executives and scholars. Now, I interact with a lot of scholars, but I don't interact with so many CEOs. So before we get to the book and any opening remarks by Judy, my imagination runs wild. So I just want to check in with Judy here. I imagine Aspen as something like a lower key Davos, where all these rich people go to Switzerland and, the rich people go to Aspen. And so what are the meetings really like, and how much does self-selection play? I can imagine that the people that go to Aspen are the more responsible folks, and, the people that you really want to change, they're not going to show up there, and I'm not sure how we influence them. So
that's a fair question. You can hear me okay? Everything's
yes.
Clear on your end. Aspen is actually not at all like Davos, but I've never been to Davos because apparently the World Economic Forum feels competitive with the Aspen Institute, so they won't invite anybody who has anything to do with Aspen. So, the comparison is made because the Aspen Institute has one big public program that it does in the summertime called the Aspen Ideas Festival. And that actually was created just about, it's been maybe close to 15 years now that it's been up and running. And it brought the Institute a lot of visibility that it didn't have before, because most of the activity of the Institute, like 80% of it, happens behind closed doors.
Right.
And I'll come back to that if I could, because it's a very different model, although certainly WEF does some of that. But the program that it's compared with, the Aspen Idea Festival and the Davos, the meeting in January every year, ours is actually public. Buy a ticket, really? You can go.
Oh, I didn't know.
So that's pretty profoundly different than Davos, where it's highly coveted invitations and significant corporate sponsorship, creating lots of private forums while it's there. I mean, it's not.
Well, how much is a ticket?
Well, you can go for, I think, a couple $1,000. It's not like, it's not like, right. You'd have to be choosing that rather than going to the beach or something. So,
all right.
But, it's certainly rich people. Yes, absolutely. A lot of rich people in Aspen.
Right.
Aspen was the very first mountain town that figured out how to be alive 4 seasons a year. And they did that. The Aspen Institute, depending on who you talk to, was essentially a real estate play, or it was trying to, create world peace and save humanity. But somewhere in there, it did get into the business of hosting meetings in Aspen, and it did revive the town. I think it's fair to say that in combination, it spun off the Aspen Music Festival. It spun off the Aspen Physics Institute. It used to be called the Aspen Institute for the Humanities, and it was about dialogue, and it's still about dialogue. It's principally about dialogue and leadership development. So I'll just say that programs like ours, the Aspen Institute, is essentially a platform for our work, and we stay within the lanes of bipartisanship, but our work isn't really engaging partisans much anyway. It's really business people, and we're not always aware what party they come from. Lots of stripes these days. They're not all Republicans anymore.
And you're headquartered in New York, right? So it's not, And
Society program is in New York. The headquarters of the Institute's in Washington, D.C., and most of the staff are in Aspen. I mean,
Oh,
most of the staff are in Washington, and then
Washington.
Aspen essentially is a conference center.
Yeah.
So it's where the Institute started, and it's a highly coveted place to hold meetings.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, well, that's a fun place to go to for
Yes.
a
Yeah.
conference.
But
Right.
when we hold a meeting, it'll be like for 20 people or 30 people. We're doing one this year for the very first time in a long time that will have 100 people there. So
Oh,
it's not,
that's
and that's the action of most of these programs that work on a very discrete topic, and they're bringing people together across different perspectives
oh,
to
that's
really
pretty.
chew on something and try to find where the solutions are and the common ground. But we're not society, we're interested in bringing people together that share concern over a domain. They may
Uh-huh.
not all agree on how we make improvements, but they
Uh-huh.
kind of are all leaning in the same direction. And then
Right.
it's about trying to find better solutions and then figure out ways to give them traction.
Well, that's not too. I used to go. Before COVID, I used to go to. It used to be called SRI in the Rockies. Now it's just
Yes.
SRI, I guess. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm going the next time, but yeah, it's not too much. Although, and that's bigger than Aspen if you're only getting 100 people or.
Well, the Ideas Fest, when they do the big conference, is probably 1,500 people that
Oh,
come
okay.
through
All
in
right.
a week.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay.
So it's definitely, if you take over the entire campus and people don't all stay on campus, you can stay in town. So, the
Right.
facilities would house,
Yeah.
much larger
Yeah. Well, that's pretty.
meetings of people traveling through. So,
Yeah.
but it's still
And
an
it,
intimate environment. And you do get, there's something that happens when you're not in the city, it's a pain to get there. It takes a long time. And so people tend to stay and be
right.
part of something longer than if they were just going to float in to speak.
Yeah, you're not drifting out to some cafe. People aren't going to bars. I mean, they're kind of staying around the conference most of the
Right.
time.
Yeah.
Right.
And the business issues, as we'll talk about, are complicated. People may share kind of a vision of how it ought to work, but they have very different sense of what's a priority or how they act in the real
Yeah.
kind of heat of the what's cooked, what it's producing. So there's always plenty to talk about.
Well, speaking of things to talk about, so one of the things I loved about your book is you gave an analogy of a stack of books. So here's a stack of books, yours, and over there on the shelf, I don't know if you can, but I've got John Lakumnik, I've got the handbook, but I don't have some of the older, like the shareholder value myth, the divine right of capital, and Margaret Blair's ownership and control, which all very much influenced me. Coming up, I thought, those are, and meeting with Lynn and Margaret. When Margaret moved to Tennessee, she had me come out to speak to a class, and I forgot what day it was, so I didn't make the plane. It's like, of all the things that I could do, it's just, I mean, I don't. That's the biggest guffaw that I think I've had in meetings. Anyway, one of the things I'm wondering, I'm just curious if you had read Carol Pateman's Participation in Democratic Theory. Did you ever read that, or you ever come? No.
Oh, no, I haven't. It sounds
Yeah,
like something I could be interested in, though.
yeah, you might take a look at it. I mean, she wrote this is much before the other ones. I think Pateman was probably in the '60s, and but and she's from Australia, I believe, and she wrote. Basically, she found a strong correlation between empowerment at work and empowerment in the rest of your life, like the public sector and other places. And so, yeah, I think so that led me, at one point I had a grant from the National Institute for Mental Health as a fellow. And so I was using some of her theories because I was looking at worker ownership and worker control and those kinds of issues. And I think that it's very important today. And you seem to be talking a lot about I mean, you've got all these papers on workers' voice and workers' involvement and all that that your group has been putting out. And to me, but I don't remember you talking about, like before we got on the air, we were talking a little bit about your congressional testimony and how divided Congress is. And it's almost like meeting with two committees when you're meeting with the one committee, because you get the Republicans and the Democrats, and they both have their agenda. And one of the things is that inequality is directly correlated with political dichotomy. So the more unequal the country is, the more and more dichotomous political, there's going to be a gap that you just won't be able to come across. And it seems to me that one of the things that, there was a lot of workers who were alienated from work. They don't have a say, they don't have a voice in work. And then when they have a voice in politics, that voice just becomes a lot of times just becomes a voice of protest. It's not a voice of involvement and kind of in-depth, I want to be involved. They're going to come out once every 2 years or once every 4 years. And anyway, so just throwing that out there.
Well, come back to that, but you mentioned these the three books that you said, that these also had a lot of meaning for you. And I think it's so interesting. Well, first of all, I think it's interesting. All the books, they're all written by women. That's kind of just an interesting fact. But, I got something very discreet from each of these authors. Marjorie Kelly, when I read The Divine Right of Capital, and all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, yeah, you get your money at the IPO. Right. It's an aftermarket. Roger Martin actually did a lot in that issue as well. But it's like, why do we put so much attention on the shareholder where companies never return to the market today?
Yeah, and
a lot of them are going public without even raising capital to begin with, or they're not really going public. They're just listing their stock to allow an exit for an early round of investors. And so it's just kind of interesting. We have all this language that supports the idea that that the company is owned by shareholders. Well, you read Lynn Stout. Clear thing you get from her is that's just simply not true. Yeah. It's not, it's not the law that's holding us back, is the way I would say it. I mean, it's all kinds of things that are built into the system, the scaffolding that essentially keeps shareholder primacy in place, but it's not really the law. And she was very good about teaching us the law. And that's one of the things, real contributions she made in her lifetime. Sadly, we lost her at too young an age. Yeah. But she was out actively, teaching people, what does the law actually say? Corporations, with that whole thing about corporate personhood, you incorporate, the company essentially has the same has some of the qualities of a person legally. And we own ourselves. Nobody owns us. And it's the same thing with companies. And so the shareholders own shares of stock. They come with discrete and important rights, but they certainly aren't either in a position to be telling the company exactly what to do or to, it's more removed than that. And that's a kind of reality of modern times. And then Margaret Blair, ownership and control, she's the one that really started me thinking about intangibles and what are the real qualities of what makes up value today. And all of those things, they were very discreet and very important in developing my own thinking. So I'm very grateful for you to call out those contributors as well. And I'll definitely look up Carol Patman's work. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. I was kind of like, when I read Kelly's, Divine Right of Capital, I was kind of blown away in a way, but on the one hand, I went, well, yeah, sure. Everybody knows that they raised the money in the IPO and we're just trading on the secondary market. But I didn't really, as I went through the book, she tells it in such a great story way that, okay, it may be, anyway, it made me think even more. And I think that turned her around, because she used to have like one article that I wrote a long time ago, I submitted to Business Ethics that she was the editor of, and I got it published there. And and she moved from that, and then she wrote this book, and now she's basically working on starting cooperative. She's got this whole network, kind of setting up like a Mondragon kind of thing in the United.
Marjorie does. Yeah.
Yeah, Marjorie does, and so uh, she's moved away from whereas Lynn was always so Lynn could say uh, the shareholder value myth, secondary market, but she still was hung in there as far as, I don't know, working with attorneys that are working with the big companies, the Fortune 500 and the all that. So, and I'm not quite sure what Margaret's, I mean, ownership and control. There was two things for me there. One was the the idea of that you just mentioned that I lost. Oh yeah, intangibles. Basically, we flipped. Intangibles are the biggest piece now instead of, and so that was one. But the other one was the, well, we could have had workers hiring capital, but we had capital hiring workers. And so, but do you know what she's working on these days?
I don't. No,
Yeah.
I know. No, I'm not
Yeah.
sure what she's working on these days.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think she's still at Vanderbilt.
Yeah, she is,
Yeah.
from what I've seen.
But I think I, you know, I guess I would just say this takes me back to kind of first principles. I mean, our kind of fundamental belief is that business is kind of maybe the most important institution of our day. And it has tremendous power and influence globally, domestically. We're living through a very interesting moment right now with the decisions that business has been making about pulling out of Russia and trying to understand if there's any nuance there or there's no holds barred. This is what we have to do to respond to demand for what people want in this moment. And so it's a very interesting time to be thinking again about this. But it is our belief that we simply can't address our most complex problems. I mean, without business at the table, we're not going to get there on climate. We're not going to get there on kind of rebalancing the capitalist system without kind of the narrative and the kind of ways of thinking and operating that have to change in business. So
Yeah. Well,
all of these women had great pieces of the puzzle to help us think about that. But I think of business as being that's where the real agency resides. So
right.
it's an interesting talking to you all, where you're thinking more about the investor.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess when you're at the Aspen Institute, you're talking with mostly businesses about how they can reform their operations to accomplish things for stakeholders and society, improve the world. And
Well, we kind of do two things. We design and support kind of conversations that usually take place over a long period of time. We're thinking now about one that requires us to bring business people to the table. Not always the CEO, but can often be somebody who has global responsibilities or C-suite level. But also a lot of those who advise, consultants and
mm-hmm.
lawyers and, people who are heavy into kind of translating what these outside pressures are and what are the protocols inside to respond. But then we also do a lot of work with change agents who work inside the business, people that have who kind of a community of practitioners to be able to kind of draw both the enthusiasm for the work and to sustain kind of complex change over a long period of time. And there's no shortage of demand for that kind of conversation as well. And these are people that often they may be working in ways that may take some risk, or they need to get the buy-in inside their companies to do things that certainly are commonsensical and make a lot, that are there's a lot of demand for fresh thinking inside companies, and we're trying to support those change agents.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, that's one thing. Like I've had a recent proposal at Facebook, and I've always bumped my head, and I should remember what her name was, what her name is. But anyway, she was from outside, and she was brought into Facebook to work with shareholders and other stakeholders, and is doing a very good job. And so they actually negotiated with me this year instead of just basically putting up the brick wall and saying we have total control and we don't have to listen to anybody. So, and I think that there's people like that at a lot of different companies that those are the people we need to network with, that they're trying to change their world from the inside, and they're looking for people on the outside that they can work with to help them do that. So yeah. So what got you into Aspen? Or how did you get just a couple minutes on your background? Just curious.
I'm
I
from
think
California, worked in
yeah.
Sacramento after I got out of college. And, that started me, I was there in 1978 when Proposition 13 passed, which was the tax revolt of then.
Right.
We've had tax revolts since, but that was a big one where simultaneously in both California and Massachusetts, there were initiatives in California was an initiative on the ballot. I think it might have also been one in Massachusetts, but it essentially rolled back the property taxes and to an earlier level. And all of a sudden, all of this, the principal source of funding for state and local government, or for local governments, cities and counties, had been taken off the table. I mean, had been significantly reduced. And it was all about kind of how are we going to pay for things? And so I thought, I think I better go to business school because I don't know what a bond is. And so,
Oh.
so anyway, and I was interested in how things get done. So I ultimately went east, got an MBA, rolled into banking, worked in middle market lending. But I then after being in banking for a while, I started doing kind of the social impact job for the Ford Foundation. That's what it would be called now, but it was a discrete program that allowed us to invest in economic activity, housing development, things where there was some kind of a revenue stream. So worked on that, but it was during that period of time we had all of these CEOs who were on the board of the Ford Foundation. People like Henry Schacht from Cummins Engine then, and then at Lucent, Chris Hogg, who was the head of Reuters at the time, and Bob Haas, who was the head of Levi Strauss, and David Kearns at Xerox, and Ratan Tata at Tata Industries. And they started essentially saying, why doesn't the Ford Foundation ever talk about the private sector? Aren't we missing something here? And I was kind of deputized by them to figure out what that might mean. And that really put me on a very different track. And I ultimately left Ford with funding to start this program at Aspen, because it was very clear that there were companies that were kind of ahead of the curve and that they were operating on lots of different motivations. I mean, Levi Strauss might have been kind of a family legacy that propelled them to treat workers with the kind of care and respect that they did. And when they finally went offshore, it was late, and they probably should have gone earlier, but they really were thoughtful about these company towns that they had responsibility for, to a Nike where Phil Knight had essentially received a quick kick in the rear from NGOs who were challenging the business model when it came to child labor. And so, it could be for very different reasons, but these companies would tend to leapfrog ahead of their peers. And I was trying to figure out, why? What does this look like? And are we just dependent on idiosyncratic stories? Or is there something bigger at play here that's emerging? And so we started working in business schools and went on to then Enron hit. Then we started looking at short-termism in business and capital markets. And that took us on to corporate purpose and the design of incentives and pay and work on worker voice. So it's been a good run. There's always plenty to work on.
Well, I listened to part of your congressional testimony and then looked at it later. But you said that 2 years after the Business Roundtable statement, for the top 1% of the U.S., wealth grew by 11.5 trillion versus 1.6 trillion for the bottom 50%. So, and you discuss quite a bit in your six principles, how transformative the Business Roundtable statement was. And, the cynic in me looks at that. So one of the things I was fighting, I think it was at the time that maybe the Business Roundtable's a year later. Anyway, they were among the sponsors or the people that went to the SEC and said, let's get rid of small retail shareholders filing proposals, because the five of us or whatever filed 30% of the proposals. So they tried to cut us off at the knees. And to me, this just seemed like a PR statement. And but you seem to put more credence to it than I do. Although it did get a lot of press, and that's good. Because I think that we all do believe that businesses should work for the good of society. But is there any evidence that it's really done anything, I guess is.
I think you're asking a fair question. I'll stand on the belief that what they did was important. It got a lot of press because they made sure it did.
Yeah.
If you recall, they took out full page ads in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and
That'll help.
it was like the shot heard around the world from where we sat. I mean, I couldn't believe how much press they got. And they were very intentional. And then leadership, Jamie Dimon and the like were very, outspoken about it. So changing the narrative is critically important. If you kind of read, Danella Meadows' work around, if you're really going to go through, if you require a real change in behavior, you got to start with kind of the mindset. You have to, and that is, so what is the prevailing mindset? I think what we see is that kind of executives are saying one thing, but I don't think that they're acting on it. And I think that's because whether by design or just by how hard it is to change once it's in play, we're still held back by the scaffolding of shareholder primacy, without a doubt. I mean, the best piece that's been written on that, it was also written by a woman, Lynn Payne, who's on the faculty at Harvard Business School, wrote a really great article with Joe Bauer. So there was also a man on that, called The Error at the Heart of Corporate Leadership. It's an article in HBR, and it really lays out the kind of the myriad ways in which shareholder primacy is still there by design. So you got to start with intentions, because if you're not clear on the intentions, nothing can change. But we've got work to do. What can I say? I think several things have happened. I think this kind of ESG conversation that is bubbling along and maybe taking on more power, we'll see. If it just ends up being a flash in the pan, or if it's something that actually drives real change. I think it's complicated. I think that's kind of connected. I think this opening up of the conversation over here. I think that there all that press that came out at the time that essentially said it wasn't both from cynics and others who were looking at it, essentially saying, wow, it's pretty remarkable. You got 200 CEOs to all sign on to this. Well, I think they really did look at this and say, we are doing it. Of course, we have to listen to all of these various entities that have some say or are affected by our decisions. And I would say that's largely true.
Yeah.
We have this idea about shareholders, as being the organizing principle. These are everyone on this call knows how remarkably complex these corporations are.
Yeah.
In some cases, hundreds of thousands of employees, operating well over 100 jurisdictions, countries around the globe. You can't possibly ignore all of these other inputs that are required, whether it's, a license to operate in particular countries, whether, certainly employees, let's come back to that, because that is a growing kind of conversation. I think, in fact, they are an important accountability mechanism. I think it's arguable whether they're the most important one or will be going forward. I think all of that is true. But back at the ranch, we've designed into the system over the last 40 years important ways in which the shareholder is elevated. And, it's in the design of pay, it's in the design of the kind of quarterly mindset and the constant drumbeat and, all of these kind of ways in which it's baked into how we operate. And so,
Well, I've always been attracted to the stakeholder model, but on the other hand, I've always also listened to the Bob Monks on my left shoulder that says, who's going to hold you've got to have some rights to hold somebody accountable. And so shareholders at least have voting rights with regard to shares. Employees, their rights have all been stripped away largely by Congress and eroded through the courts and whatever as far as unionizing and and governments. I mean, these companies they move they have their assets moved through other countries so that they can avoid taxes, and I don't see where the accountability mechanisms are other than through shareholders.
Unionization is it's not going to roar back here. We'll see what happens this week in Staten Island with the Amazon plant.
Yeah.
And then back to Bessemer, Alabama again for that vote. The press would suggest that that's not going to pass, or that the union will not be voted in. More will be revealed, but I think the employees are, unlike investors. I think the employees are really aligned with the enterprise. They want the same thing the company does. They want it to last a long time. They want it to be, remarkably successful. That is the bet they've placed for their economic and financial security. And increasingly, I think they have a better lens on the risks. And so I think it's fair to say that the form of what that looks like will continue to evolve. I don't know that we're going to see unions in this country. We're clearly allergic to employees on boards, which I think could make a lot of sense, and works in other economies. It doesn't, but in the US, again, we somehow think, well, we can't have an honest conversation if there's employees there. Well, why?
Right.
There's plenty of research on open book management that says, the more you share, the better off, the management is. So I think that, but I think it's an interesting moment. We've seen a lot of interesting examples. One of the most interesting examples actually was Amazon, where the employees were in part, buoyed by the fact that they do own stock. So they were able to take a proxy action, on behalf, like most of them. It didn't pass, but it sure as hell got the attention.
And what was that?
Of Jeff Bezos. I think there were 7,000. Initially, there were 7,000 employees who signed on to a petition. It was on climate.
Oh,
and I think it's fair to say that the workforce is as concerned about climate as investors are, and they're not conflicted. The investors are all over the map. They come in lots of shapes and sizes. They're what they care about, depends on who they are. And we can talk about the best investors and those who are really long-term aligned, but even pension funds are conflicted. They don't want to give up any return.
Right.
So, what's interesting, I think, is, and this is back to the question of narrative, one of the things that keeps shareholder primacy in place is this narrative around, things like pay for performance and, as if performance only means one thing, the stock price. Right. But also all of this narrative that this is kind of a win-win world, that if the company does the right things, everybody will be better off. But that's not vaguely true.
Yeah.
It's not true. There's real costs involved in supporting your workforce to the level that we've seen it needs to be supported if we're not going to continue to have employees hemorrhaging. I just listened to this great, the New York Times podcast, their Sunday read was about nurses that are now taken to the road, and are making manyfold what nurses that are tethered to a particular hospital are making. Well, that's not turning back. And employees that are in one particular hospital are not going to be willing to settle for a fraction of the wages of somebody who comes in and works for a couple of months and then takes off on the road again. So I think COVID has exposed some very interesting things about workers that will take some time to play out. And I don't think it's going to necessarily look like unions. I don't think it's going to look like Germany and, Scandinavia either. But I think it's not that high risk. to see more experimentation around where worker voice really comes into the fore. And frankly, I think, you know, the worker voice thing has been quite useful to companies. They are raising questions about real risk, particularly around climate. They're speaking honestly about things that need to be true for the welfare of the workforce, which, you know, we're not going to, they are the company. They're not a stakeholder. I hate the term stakeholder.
Yeah.
I particularly hate it when we're talking about employees. They're not a stakeholder.
Right.
It's their company. They are the company. They are the, you know, they're the link to the supply chain. They're the link to customer service and loyalty.
Yeah.
You know, they're the link
remember
to the quality of the product.
one case study I remember reading a long time ago was in the UK, somebody bought out a company and they paid millions and millions of dollars for it. But the employees decided that they didn't want to go with the with the folks that bought them out. So all the employees walked out and formed their own company, and the company was left with, you know, tables and chairs. And, you know, I mean, it was, you know, they had paid what they had paid for was what was in the minds of the employees, and the employees left. So it didn't, you know, they just lost out completely. Well, so one of the things that led me, so I had tried getting workers on boards through the, you know, let's just dump them in from the top, or what, you know, let's, without any kind of real support mechanisms like they have in co-determination, because we don't have a big union structure here. So, and that didn't work because even CalPERS wouldn't vote for it. So now my tactic is more, let's at least start by reporting the shares that get distributed, you know, so shareholders have to vote, you know, when to approve shares, incentive shares. And we know that most of that at most companies goes to the CEO and the named executive, and then a little bit to the board. But it doesn't go. So, you know, what I'm asking for is give us a matrix and show us where does that go in the company, you know, and ideally they'd give us an EEO1 matrix, you know, with all these categories.
You can actually see who owns what.
Yeah. Then you could see, okay, who got
who your allies are.
Yeah. And then, and the idea eventually would be, this would be, I'm thinking of like climate. Okay, first you get them to report on, you know, what they're doing, the pollution that they're putting out, and now you get them to, later on, you get them to report, well, how do you tamp that down? How do you address it? And so, but, you know, I don't know if that's going to work at all, because it might end up just like CEO pay, where, you know, okay, now they have to do a pay ratio, and CEOs look at that and say, well, I'm only getting 100 to 1, whereas this guy's getting 400 to 1. I need to up my pay, you know. Like,
no evidence that shareholders care about that. There's no evidence that employees care about it.
Yeah.
They kind of intuitively both understand this is a tiny, you know, bump on the overall cost structure and performance of the enterprise. And they're, you know, I think employees seem to kind of go along with the idea that, well, you know, it's a hard job, maybe earns it, you know, as long as the things are heading in the right direction. And the questions are raised. But, you know, so I think employees are more likely potentially to start raising questions about what does fairness look like internally to the firm. You know, we've done a lot on CEO pay, and
would it help if they own part of the company, if they had a voice that way too? Or
it possibly could. I mean, it's certainly, you know, we are seeing some innovations that happen, you know, where boards are starting to kind of redesign committees, bring in employees for different reasons. You know, there's health and safety committees that were created during COVID, this and that. You know, it's a pretty tense issue. The current issue, though, is the ones who have say on pay are investors, and they never vote again. I mean, they do a fraction more than they were before, but as long as the stock price is going up, they stick with it. The only time that you start to get, you know, bad votes on say on pay is if the company, you know, and shareholders feel like they're not getting, you know, their share. And since they're taking, you know, 95% of all of the profits out already, it's like, I don't know how much more they expect they can get. There's only so much you can do to continue to goose TSR if the stock is fairly priced. So,
buybacks seems to be the way to do it, I guess.
Buybacks. And of course, when money was free, you know, more of them were going on.
Yeah.
But, and, you know, a lot of companies buying, or borrowing in order to execute on that. But it's stock manipulation. It was Lynn
Right.
Stout who used to say that, whatever. 15 years ago, 15 years ago it was illegal.
Yeah. And there doesn't seem to be any movement to try to make it illegal anymore, right?
I haven't seen any. I think it may appear I believe some bill that's in Congress somewhere that's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But I do think that, a little bit back to the executive thing. The low point for me the last year was when the Business Roundtable essentially pulled their support for the Build Back Better bill because of the tax provisions. The average, I think the effective tax rate is something like 7.8%.
On corporation.
Look at that across corporations. And so the fact that, there was an attempt to raise taxes in order to pay for the extraordinary investment we need to make. Meanwhile, the share buybacks dwarf the amount of money that's anticipated to put into investments that are needed to make these adjustments and to make the commitments.
I tried to address share buybacks through shareholder proposals, and they got shot down by the SEC as, okay, well, that's part of the pay, and you can't. I forget exactly what the rationale, but it's basically no action. So I'm not sure how to attack it, and there doesn't seem to be any congressional support for ending it. So I don't know. So I want to point out we're getting towards the top of the hour here, and we do have some folks that have joined us. And if people have questions, you could put them into the chat, or you could just raise your hand, or and we can open your microphone. So I've got more questions, and I can continue. But so Ed, did you have something?
Hi. Good afternoon. Thanks for hosting this event. I do have a question, and it's kind of a little bit of an open-ended one, and it was regarding the comment about shareholders and them not really having an interest or vested stake, I guess, in CEO pay. It'd be interesting, how are you defining shareholders? Because I'm a shareholder in quite a few companies, and Jim, we connected on a company a long time ago. I'm jogging your memory here, but I was an activist shareholder alongside you in a company, and we were woefully disappointed in governance and management. And we were able to at least rally other shareholders, both institutional and individual, to try to drive change. We were effective. We changed over the whole board. But we didn't ultimately accomplish the end result, which was better governance, better management, and a better stock price. So great effort, achieved one of the objectives, but lost the war. So my question goes back to, as an individual shareholder and a former CEO and an executive in Fortune 500 companies, I do have strong interest in executive pay. I think, like many, I guess, it's out of whack. I think it's not necessarily tied to performance. And I almost feel, as an executive, I would feel guilty taking some of that money because it's just out of whack in relation to your average employee. And where it gets really bad is when the company underperforms, and yet the rewards are still given to the executives. So long introduction to, is the shareholder basically, in many cases, the fund manager, who is really the one that's representing, and if you narrow the universe down, let's just say on any company, they may represent the various fund managers, 30, 40, 50% of the shareholder base. But they're really, in some regards, I don't think, the shareholders, because a lot of them are representing individual shareholders who really have zero say, right? So if I have my money in a mutual fund or in a hedge fund or whatever, I'm probably not impacting the decision making from a shareholder perspective. It's the fund manager, and the fund manager may be totally disconnected with what I am interested in. So I just go back to that point about shareholders not being interested in executive comp. I think there are more that probably would be, but they're individual retail shareholders, and they have zero impact and say on the matter. If they did, I think it would rise a lot higher. But so my question is, how do you define a shareholder?
Can I answer a different question?
Sure.
I'll let you figure. I mean, I totally agree with the fact that the ones who are influential, who actually move companies, are the ones who are, you know, whatever the form, direct and sustained engagement with companies. But I'm going to guess by your language, you think pay for performance means performance means stock price performance. And you're getting the reason that the reason CEOs pay is so astronomical is because of the weight on stock. 60, 70, 80, 90% of pay packages are anchored in stock. And so as long as stock price is going up, they're going to continue to outpace everybody else. And they are, the executive team is, I don't know, for well over a decade, I think maybe 2 decades or something like that. They've been going up 7 to 10% a year, something like that. Not every single year, but by and large they are, and nobody else is, 3%, the rest of us in nonprofits and, lower ends of, we get kind of cost of living, it's
Right.
not, it's just, so what are we talking about here? And is it really possible? Is it possible to assume that these other things that we're saying are also important, like the wellness and well-being and ability to retain, a healthy workforce, can be achieved when, if you pay them more, the stock price goes. Is that thing back 2011 when Google announced that they were going to add 1,500 people to the workforce? And the stock jumped, fell out of bed the next day. When those analysts that were criticizing American Airlines and Delta when they came off of bankruptcy and wanted to catch up a bit and pay the pilots more, these guys were saying, "What are you doing with our money?" Well, it's not your money. It's not your money. It's the company's money. And it's just like this real attitude that somehow you can have it both ways. We can have these expectations of companies, and but still we want the CEO tethered to the stock price, and that's the design of pay. I think we have to break the whole system.
And how would you?
I think the right relationship is between the CEO and the enterprise, not the CEO and peers that sit outside the firm.
So you would look internally. You would look internally at the pay structure. Yeah.
Absolutely. What's the right relationship between the CEO and his or her direct reports?
Right.
Just keep on going down layers. Does this work? We want teamwork. We want this loyalty. We want people inside to be able to both understand and do what's right by the health of the enterprise. If you're a long-term investor, you ought to be very aligned with that.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the same magical thinking that we get from consumers, which is, I want my car to be able to go faster than any other car on the highway, but I want it to be fuel efficient. It's like, it's back to Dieselgate and VW or other examples where Amazon, it's like, oh yeah, I want my package and I want it to arrive yesterday, but I don't want to have to pay for any of the real costs of doing that. I just think that we've got it's not a win. We're just not in a win-win world, and I don't know why shareholders should be getting a greater share.
And if I can one more comment on the CEO pay and the stock, and I'll definitely sign off for others. I do think, though, as a shareholder, whether it's retail or institutional, we'd all be thrilled if when we purchased the stock, and a certain period after, the stock was up. And you're right, I guess we would turn a blind eye almost on the CEO's pay as long as we were appreciated in our stock. But the reality, unfortunately, is that it's not tied to the CEO pay directly, because the CEO and management, let's just say, and governance, their stock price fluctuates, right, based on options. So they could underperform in the market one year. The stock could be half. I could have lost half of my money. They're just getting options at a lower price, and they could appreciate back to neutral, to zero. And in their view, they've actually appreciated the stock, right? It's gone up 50% from the low point. Well, from my point, it hasn't gone up. I've actually been underwater for a year, and now I'm just breaking even, where executives don't look at it that way, or boards don't look at it that way. They look at it as, hey, it's appreciated from when I was given the stock and the exercise price. So I think it's almost, it's kind of like a little bit of a Vegas example. The cards are stacked in favor of the house no matter what. And I think you have to kind of somehow improve that ratio between shareholders and executives.
Then you're not going to like my answer. Get them out of it. Get them out of stock.
Yeah.
I agree. You can walk with your feet. You do. But unfortunately, a lot of times when you do that, you wind up taking a big loss, right? And, I know this is altruistic, but how do you walk away taking a loss and the executives and the governors, the board, actually taking some loss too? It shouldn't be just all gain on one side and
No, I'm
predominantly.
saying get the executives out of stock.
Oh,
Yeah. Why aren't they just paid like normal?
Aren't they just paid? The
Yeah.
incentives don't work for professionals.
Yeah.
Incentive work for peace workers.
Yeah.
We're
Let's
clear
hear
on the
from Eric.
behavioral motivations here. It's a misalignment between the incentive systems that are designed for executives and the work they really have to do. These are jobs that require real judgment,
Right.
and we're paying them, even now with all of this new ESG metrics. And I know Eric's patiently waiting here, so we'll turn it over to him. But even with all these new ESG metrics, you have to ask, do we really need to be giving executives an incentive to execute on the carbon commitments that they've made?
Right.
Do we really need to give them an incentive to care about diversity inside the firm? I don't think so.
Saving the world should be something that you should just want to do.
Or that not even wanted, not even, I don't think it's a morality thing or it's an ethical thing. It's just like, it's a risk. These are risk factors.
Yeah.
You got it. Good managers will naturally think about these things. It's demanded of them. They're not. So I think it's going to require a real generational shift, but I'm not convinced that the shareholders are really care as much about the long-term health of the company as
The employees.
well, aside.
Eric.
Regardless of the recent roundtable comment on stakeholders, boards have been doing, in my opinion, and I've been on them, a good job of balancing obligations to various constituents over time, not just the last 5 years, but 10, 20 years. And they have the flexibility to do so until it comes to selling the company, in which case it really is shareholder primacy. And in terms of law and how they're advised in terms of potential liability for themselves and the company, where it really is just the stock price at the end of the day, and not taking anything else into consideration, including the fate of workers, whether they stay or not, and their situations and other constituents as well. So my question is do you have a problem with that? What are your thoughts?
I think it's a discrete and overall limited right. In other words, yeah, it's true. But change of control, that, maybe it happens once in a lifetime of a shareholder and executive given the firm. It's not, in other words, it's an important differential for shareholders. Yes, I agree.
Okay.
I don't think it speaks to, and I'm not so sure, frankly, that I would agree with your description that it's kind of worked out pretty well for everybody up until now.
Yeah.
I don't think we have the evidence of that. Inequality is it's a route. What inequality is winning.
Yeah.
CEOs, surprisingly, we think that the highest, earners are, rock stars and, movie stars or whatever, baseball players. It's CEOs. CEOs make up 70%, I think, of that top 1% that we keep on talking about, the uber wealthy. CEOs and other high earners and professional classes that, are part of the same system. It's pretty shocking.
Yeah.
Actually. And it's, inequality, climate change, we're not addressing it. these are, if we believe that climate is about industrialization, where else is it supposed to come from? It should come from setting the rules in government. I agree with that. But business is in cahoots on this one. They're gonna, it's regulatory capture all over again. So I don't think it has been working out well for everybody.
Well,
Certainly hasn't been working out well for employees. And look at a company like Google, half of their employees work for the firm, the other half are on contracts where they have to go on and off the contract every 9 months, so they don't get considered a full-time employee, where they have, less pay, less benefits, less,
Right.
security, and very few of them migrate onto the payroll. And it's over, I think it's like 130,000 employees, 150,000 contractors, or somewhere in there.
Yeah, yeah.
This is no surprise that the stock does really well. Well, if you can have a business model where your essential workforce is sitting in a contract and they have no ability to get onto the flywheel of actually being a part of the success of the enterprise,
Right.
I don't think that's fair. I don't
Well,
think that's even close.
That seems like I remember years and years ago, I looked at Sara Lee, and they were, they used to be a baking company, and then they became a holding company. Everything was contracted out, and it seems like that's become the model of Apple. I mean, they don't, although you do design and software and everything, but everything is manufactured elsewhere. So, and even the janitor, everybody, the largest part of the workforce is contracted out. So it seems like that's the way, and it seems like, more and more of the money, like money is not a problem, as you started out, when you go out to your initial public offering, you're not raising money to build a plant, you're raising money to sell your initial shares to someone so that you can have greater liquidity. And it seems, it just seems like we've bought into the trickle down world where all the money's going to the top, but yet, if you look at the IMF, they find that if you give money to the top, if the top earns more money, the GDP goes down. If you give that same money to the bottom 20%, GDP goes up substantially more than what it would go down to the 1%. So, we don't seem to be figuring out that, okay, well, we need to equalize, I don't know. Give us some hope here, Judy, before we turn out. It's like, okay. I mean, I look at the situation, it just seems kind of grim, because I don't see, I mean, even with CalPERS, I go to CalPERS and I ask them, and they're voting against more than half the CEO pay. And I ask them, what are you doing to stop the ratcheting of CEO pay? Because every year they survey, they find out who's above average, and they raise the average. That average raises every year. And for CalPERS, as well as for many other funds, as long as CEO pay is tied to performance, they're willing to pay them. The sky's the limit. How do we fix that?
I do think we are at a kind of a inflection point. I think, boomers will eventually have to retire from boards. There will be, a opportunity to change it up. I'm told from people that are much closer to CEO search than I am, that they understand that their job has changed. They are, in fact, kind of leading a community of interests. It's not just about one or two constituents. That's more aligned with probably the reality of what you have to do to run a successful company. And I think we'll see innovation inside firms, because we have it's a market reality here. We're going to have to. But I'm pretty clear on, I can see a picture where employees have more power. I don't assume that will necessarily make people on this call happier. I think that they're probably more aligned with the kinds of decisions that I'd be looking for if we assume that the businesses are the wealth creators and they do need to address inequality. And no, it's not free, and it's not rising tide lifts all boats. We have to do some course correction, or the whole system's going to fail. That
Yeah.
sounds a little apocalyptic here, I
Oh,
believe.
no, that sounds positive. But I'm not sure what forces, just generational, basically, you're saying, because the generations behind us are more concerned with those externalities and other things that we don't care about.
Yeah, and I think when we get more diverse boards and we actually, I mean, I don't know why, it's commonplace to have term limits for boards in the nonprofit sector, but somehow it never comes up in the for for public companies. I just don't really understand that. Why do we want people to stay on a board forever?
Well,
It doesn't make sense. I mean, somebody said it's easier to get diversity on the board than to make room for it. In other words, getting people off of boards is a bigger problem but I think we need real change in boards. I think we really need.
I remember one thing at CalPERS that was raised up, well, should we have term limits? And at that point, there was people who had been on the board for 36 years, 30 years, there was, so the people on the CalPERS board had served there for multiple decades. They were not going to vote for a policy that put term limits in. Matt, you've got a question here.
No, Jim, you kind of asked my question around solutions. Maybe I'll just, the other thing I'll note, Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, they're not interested in any dialogue really with shareholders. They're not interested in getting on board with creating any sort of net zero ambitions, goals, accountability for the board. I mean, I don't know. I just think of like people in that kind of power and influence who aren't really moving. And I'm hearing you say, well, maybe when that generation transitions off, I just don't know. I'm not as hopeful maybe that the new board and the new CEO isn't going to just kind of keep they've got control of the company. What are they, what incentive do they have?
Do they get a free pass or something? What is it about Berkshire Hathaway?
They
What
do
is
get
it
a
about
free
that?
pass.
We
It's
all
like
think
grandpa.
yeah, maybe. But I don't think I don't think that looks like all public companies. And I feel like there's a lot of expectations that are changing. Climate is in fact an existential problem. And, I think that we're going to have a real reckoning when it comes to what companies are going to have to do. I just think it's taken a long time to get there. So I don't know what to say about, but you're much closer to it, I'm sure, than I am. But I kind of feel like they're somehow in a different category, and I don't understand exactly why. But obviously it comes with a lot of respect over a guy who's made a lot of money for the shareholders for lots and lots of years and seems to not need to be in the limelight of doing that, is willing to invest in brands that aren't, big consumer. I think it's interesting. I know a lot of people just think he's just the best, but it feels like there's something a little bit out of sync with where the enterprise is going to have to go at some point. If it's representative of what's happening more generally with public companies, it's like a holding company. It's just like protecting all of those enterprises.
Yeah. So did you watch Don't Look Up or Severance?
I did. I watched Don't Look Up. I can only take a little bit of Severance at a time.
Oh, yeah, I can't either. It's too much.
There isn't anybody there that is very likable. Let's just put it that way.
No, there
And
isn't.
so, I have to take that in doses, but,
Yeah.
is that I don't know what that means. I do think, it's, the reality is worse, maybe. I don't,
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, Severance is like, okay, it's like you have absolutely no agency at work or anywhere else. You're basically split. So here, we'll get a last.
But here's one to look at check out the documentary that was released in the last weeks on Boeing.
Oh, uh-huh.
It's a sad story about shareholder, kind of profit maximization.
And the motivation of not looking at things that, like, okay, this is going to crash the plane. Yeah.
No, it was beat Airbus at any cost.
Okay, Ed, we'll give you the last question here.
Okay, thanks. What role, I guess, then does government play in all of this? Because
Right.
shareholders aren't going to really, I think, be able to impact, and unless there's radical reform, I believe, in the whole governance and corporate structure, which I know, Jim, you've been working tirelessly to accomplish, right? Employees, as we talked about, do have skin in the game, but they're not going to have the power, I think, to influence large multinationals. And the reason I came
Oh, they do influence them. I think there's really stunning examples of that being the case. But sorry, Ed, I cut you off. Back to you.
Oh, no, thank you. And I love to hear that. But the reason I'm coming around to government, I stumbled upon by accident the Elliot Spitzer story, and we all know how that went. But prior to him, getting derailed, he seemed like he started to have a very strong influence on Wall Street, on nepotism and nefariousness in corporate America, et cetera. And he started making some headway, it seemed like. And I almost feel like, fortunately, unfortunately, government seems to be the only vehicle and constituency that may be able to drive radical, meaningful change. Do you think that can happen?
Not as long as companies have their, are controlling the game through political spending and kind of saying one thing and lobbying for something else. I think that's the root of a lot of problems. I think our money in politics is out of control. And interestingly enough, and you may or may not like this example, but after the Capitol, breaking the Capitol on January 6th, and a lot of companies, at least dozens, it may have been more than that, who paused their financial support for what they call the 138, is it? The members of Congress that refused to certify the election. Well, that was because employees are the ones that stood up and said, followed, connected the dots and said, what are we doing here with our political spending? And that is it's a live conversation. And I think it continues to play out. Employees are the ones that are making companies really step up on climate.
Huh.
That is, they're sitting in this interesting place between the inside and the outside. But that doesn't mean that government couldn't do something. I mean, let's start with fixing the capital gains tax. If you ask, I was on something, I'm sitting on a commission with the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, where they're kind of looking at the future of boards. And I was, once again, you heard people that sit on boards talking about long-term as being 3 years. It's like, what? 3 years? I mean, you're making boards and executives are making decisions that are playing out for generations here.
Right.
And the idea that somehow 3 years can only be considered long-term by a short-term shareholder. I don't know who else would consider 3 years a very long-term play. And here we are back in government. The cap gains tax still rewards 1 year as being long-term.
Right.
Well, that is when we issued the principles of long-term value creation after Enron imploded several years later. We spent years kind of saying, how did that happen? And does short-termism really exist? And what would it look like? What is the solution space here? And ended up, doing stuff on corporate purpose and how do you amplify the voice of long-term shareholders, and then started looking back then at pay. And, it was an obvious recommendation back then. And there were lots of ways to do it where you could feather the kind of, make it so that after 10 years, you're not paying any gain at all, like really reward long-term holding. But then, you're helping people lock in and you're turning down the noise of the constant drumbeat of those things that we want companies to do. We want them to put people to work. We want them to invest in the kinds of skills that workers are going to need to survive. The system itself is not healthy when 44 million Americans are working full-time at jobs that are below the poverty line. This is just, it's designed for who is it, Ray Dalio, who's been out, saying, oh my God, we know how this will end. So now you could say to Raul Dalio, well, then fix the carried interest exception. Why do the capitalists pay less than
Right.
labor, on their earnings? I mean, it's like that is, to me, that's the kind of thing that makes me cynical. So boy, I sound like a real commie today, don't I?
No, that's good. Well, hey, if you want to pick me up, Judy, you should read this book, Six New Rules of Business, because this contains some great stories where you've talked to you've actually, one of the things is when I talk to people, well, give me an example of a company that's doing the right thing. And you've got the examples. So very good there.
I think that's a good thing to end on, is that there are a lot of companies that do it differently. And it's good to remember that most of them, it's really in their business model that they believe very much that they have to treat their employees well in order for the whole thing to work. Think Southwest, or think
Right.
JetBlue, or think, I like companies like Herman Miller, who have always honored the kind of human quotient of this, because they're about design. You need the designer, and that enabled them to kind of catch the flywheel on sustainability, because moving sustainability into design, of course, is where the real action is. It can't be an afterthought. And so I think there's a lot of interesting companies to look at that do it differently. We'll see what happens to Chobani if and when they ever finally go public, or they already go public. I think they're on the verge of going public. What will they do? I mean, they believe in, rewarding employees well. Will they start feeling the pressure of the shareholder? I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
All right, Judy. Well, thanks so much. And I just want to end with reminding people that next week we have David Weber, who's wrote this book a while ago now, The Rise of the Working Class Shareholder. And I remember he came out to Sacramento. I took him over to talk with folks over at CalSTRS and CalPERS, and that book has led him to talk to a bunch of different people. So we'll see what he has to say next week. And Judy, I will pay even more attention to you in the future. I was paying attention to you before, but after reading the book and listening to it online and talking to you today, I think you're onto something, and I think you've got some of the stories that will give us hope for the future. So thanks
I'm
very
glad to
much.
hear that. It's reassuring. It's not all pretty out there right now.
Yeah, no, it's not. It
Well,
isn't.
thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much, and I loved having this group to be able to mix it up with. So thanks for helping me think.
All right. Thank you.